March 7th, 1945, 07:23 hours. Somewhere in the flat, frost-hardened farmland east of the Rhine River, near the village of Rees, in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. The sky was the colour of wet concrete, low and pressing, the kind of sky that feels like it is listening. A thick morning fog rolled off the river in slow grey waves, swallowing fields whole, muffling every sound until the world felt smaller than it was, dangerous in its quiet. In that fog, a young Canadian soldier stood in the centre of a muddy farmyard with his hands raised high above his head. He was 24 years old. His boots were caked in Rhine mud. His uniform was dark with damp, and he was smiling. German troops surrounded him on all sides, their rifles pointed at his chest. At least 15 of them, maybe more, having emerged from the farmhouse, the barn, and the shallow defensive pits dug behind rusted farm equipment. Their faces showed something between confusion and unease, because this Canadian wasn't trembling the way captured soldiers usually did. He wasn't weeping or bargaining or fixing his eyes on the ground in submission. Instead, something strange was happening. His lips curled at the corners. And then, impossible in that moment, a quiet chuckle escaped his throat. The Germans exchanged glances, uncertain what to make of a prisoner who found something worth laughing at. They had no idea that in less than 1 minute, 19 of them would be dead. His name was Private Thomas Higgins. Everyone in the Regina Rifles Regiment called him Tommy. He had been born in 1921 in a small farming town outside of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, in the flat heart of the Canadian prairies, where winter arrived early and stayed long, and the wind came off the open land cold enough to stop your breath in your chest. He had grown up doing what prairie boys did, rising before the sun to do farm chores, learning patience and endurance through the sheer physical difficulty of working the land. His father grew wheat. His grandfather had grown wheat before that. Tommy had expected to grow wheat too. He joined the Canadian Army in the spring of 1942, not as part of that first wave of volunteers who had rushed to enlist in the weeks after September 1939, men flushed with patriotism and untouched by knowledge of what war actually was. By 1942, everyone knew. The disaster at Dieppe on August 19th of that year had killed or captured nearly 3,400 Canadian soldiers in a single morning of catastrophic failure on the beaches of occupied France. Tommy had read about Dieppe. He understood what he was signing up for. He signed anyway, partly because duty felt real to him in that particular prairie way, practical and quiet and not requiring explanation, and partly because his 2 older brothers were already in uniform somewhere in England, and he could not bear to be the one left behind. After basic training at Camp Borden, Ontario, he was assigned to the Regina Rifles Regiment, part of the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. He arrived in England in the early months of 1943, settling into the grinding routine of training, drilling, waiting. More than a year of preparation for something everyone knew was coming, but no one could say exactly when. Then June 6, 1944 arrived, and Tommy waded ashore at Juno Beach in Normandy, his Lee-Enfield rifle held over his head to keep it dry, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his jaw. He kept moving because the men beside him were moving. That was how you survived. Not by being brave in any heroic sense, but by keeping your feet in motion and your eyes forward. Over the 9 months that followed, Tommy survived things that quietly unmade many men around him. He survived the close, brutal fighting in the Norman Bocage country through the summer of 1944, where the hedgerows turned every field into a killing ground and artillery stripped entire forests down to splinters. He survived the Battle of the Scheldt in Belgium in the fall of that year, October and November 1944, fighting through flooded polders in freezing rain to clear the approaches to the port of Antwerp. Water up to his knees sometimes, mud everywhere, casualties mounting in conditions that felt medieval in their misery. He survived the Rhineland campaign through the brutal winter February 1945, where frostbite ate at fingers and toes, and the frozen ground was too hard to dig proper foxholes, and men sometimes died of exposure before they could be reached. By the time Operation Plunder began in late March 1945, the operation to cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of Germany itself, Tommy Higgins was not a young man anymore in any meaningful sense. He was 24 years old, but war had compressed something inside him that took decades to decompress. He had seen enough death to fill several ordinary lifetimes. He knew how to move under fire, how to read ground, how to keep his breathing steady when everything around him was coming apart. His fellow soldiers noticed that while other men prayed or cursed during artillery bombardments, Tommy told dark jokes, often about death itself, delivered in a flat prairie drawl that somehow made them funnier. His sergeant, a Nova Scotian named William Fraser, had said more than once that Tommy's laugh was worth more than a medal, because it reminded everyone that they were still human, still capable of finding something absurd in even the worst moments. Tommy also carried more grenades than standard issue. The standard Mills bomb, a serrated cast-iron sphere roughly the size and weight of a baseball, was typically issued in pairs, 2 per soldier. Tommy carried 4 on patrol, sometimes 6, clipped to the canvas webbing straps that held his equipment. Sergeant Fraser had joked that you could hear Tommy coming in the dark from the faint clinking of grenade pins. Tommy had ignored the ribbing. He had been in situations where running out of grenades meant dying, and he had no intention of making that mistake. On the morning of March 7, 1945, at approximately 06:45 hours, Tommy's section received orders to clear a series of farm buildings situated roughly 2 kilometers northeast of Rees, along a dirt road that ran parallel to a small drainage canal. Intelligence reports, assembled from aerial reconnaissance photographs taken 2 days earlier and from statements by a captured German soldier on March 5th, suggested minimal resistance. The assessment was that most German forces in this sector had withdrawn across the Rhine to establish new defensive positions on the eastern bank. The farmhouses were expected to be empty or lightly held by rearguard stragglers. The intelligence was wrong. A unit of German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, elite soldiers who had fought from the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy and back through France to this frozen corner of the German homeland, had occupied those farm buildings and turned them into a prepared defensive position. These were not conscripts or frightened teenagers. They were veterans. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running desperately low on ammunition and supplies. But they were determined, in the way only cornered men with nowhere left to go can be, to hold their position and delay the Allied advance for as long as possible. Every hour they held was another hour for other German units to dig in further east. At 07:14 hours, Tommy's section moved out in single file along the frost-hardened dirt road, moving through fog so thick you could barely see the man ahead of you. Their boots made small sucking sounds in the mud at the road's edge. There were no birds, no dogs barking from the farm, no ordinary sounds of a working rural morning. Just silence, the particular silence that experienced soldiers learn to read the way farmers read weather. Tommy was perhaps 50 meters from the first farm building when the world came apart. Machine gun fire erupted simultaneously from 3 positions. Muzzle flashes strobed from a second-floor window of the farmhouse, from the interior of the barn through a gap where boards had been removed, and from a shallow pit concealed behind an overturned iron harrow. The weapons were MG-42s, the German machine gun, that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so fast that individual shots merged into a single tearing sound like cloth being ripped quickly. 2 Canadians were hit in the first 2 seconds before anyone could react. The rest of the section threw themselves toward whatever cover existed. Stone wall to the left, drainage ditch to the right, shell craters from some earlier bombardment, shallow depressions in the frozen ground that offered only the illusion of protection. Tommy rolled into a natural dip in the earth, a slight hollow, perhaps 30 centimeters deep, and pressed himself flat. When he looked back, His section was pinned down 30 meters behind him. The machine gun positions had clean angles on that 30 meters of open ground. No one could cross it without being killed. And when Tommy assessed his own position, he understood with cold clarity that he was also trapped. If he stayed, the Germans would eventually work around his flanks. If he tried to go back, he would die crossing that open ground. Going forward was the only option, against 15 or more prepared soldiers, alone. Most men would have frozen there. Most men would have pressed their face into the mud and prayed. Tommy did something else. He thought. He stood up slowly at 07:22 hours, hands rising above his head, his rifle left deliberately on the ground behind him. As he rose, that chuckle came out of him, quiet and strange, the sound of a man who has thought of something darkly funny and cannot quite contain it. The machine guns stopped firing. German voices called back and forth. Tommy kept his hands high and his expression loose, performing surrender with every element of his body, except the 4 grenades still clipped to his webbing beneath his jacket. A young lieutenant, later identified from German regimental records as Lieutenant Wilhelm Hartmann, 23 years old, from Munich, emerged from the farmhouse doorway with his pistol drawn. Other German soldiers came out from their positions, 14 more of them clustering in the farmyard, weapons raised, moving carefully. They surrounded Tommy. He counted them without moving his eyes in any obvious way. 19, all within 10 meters. Perfect. The lieutenant spoke in broken English. Tommy nodded, still wearing that puzzling half-smile. German hands patted him down with practiced efficiency. They found his fighting knife and pulled it from its sheath. They found spare ammunition magazines in his pouches and discarded them. They checked his pockets. They did not check carefully beneath his jacket. Whether it was the fog of a routine search, the confusion caused by his bizarre demeanor, the certainty that they had already found everything dangerous, or simply the fatal human tendency to relax the moment a situation feels resolved, they missed the grenades. All 4 of them, still clipped to his webbing in the shadow of his jacket's folds. The lieutenant called out to others still positioned in the barn and farmhouse. More Germans began drifting into the farmyard, curious, wanting to see the laughing prisoner for themselves. They clustered together, shoulder to shoulder in the muddy yard, weapons angled down. The tension had left their faces. Some were smiling. At 07:23 hours and approximately 40 seconds, Tommy Higgins stopped smiling. His hands dropped. His fingers found 2 grenade pins simultaneously and pulled them in a single motion so practiced it required no conscious thought. 1 grenade in each hand. The nearest German began to lift his rifle, but that movement, even at its fastest, could not close the gap between what his eyes were seeing and what his hands needed to do in time. Tommy threw the first grenade low and hard toward the lieutenant and the cluster of men nearest the farmhouse door. He was already reaching for the 3rd grenade before the first one struck the ground. The first explosion hit at 07:23:52. The blast killed the lieutenant and 5 men around him instantly. The pressure wave knocked 3 more off their feet. Screaming began in German, short and terrible. Tommy's 2nd grenade was already in the air, arcing toward the barn window where the machine gun was positioned. The 3rd was in his hand, pin pulled, as the 2nd detonated inside the barn with a crack that blew smoke and flame from every gap in the walls and silenced the gun permanently. The surviving Germans were trying to scatter, to bring weapons up, to make sense of something that had begun too fast for their nervous systems to process correctly. Tommy threw the 3rd grenade into the largest remaining cluster of men, then grabbed the 4th while rolling sideways across the frozen mud to change his position. He pulled the pin with his teeth, something that always hurt more than it looked in training films, and hurled it at a group of 3 Germans who had taken cover behind a wooden farm cart. The 4th explosion disintegrated the cart. The farmyard was now thick with smoke and the chemical stench of detonated explosive and the iron smell of blood. Tommy scrambled forward through the murk and picked up a fallen carabiner 98K from the ground beside its dead owner. He brought it to his shoulder, found 2 Germans still standing, stunned, bleeding, their hands trembling as they tried to raise their weapons. He fired twice. Both men fell. Then silence. The whole sequence, from the moment his hands dropped until the last shot, had taken 36 seconds. Tommy stood in the center of the farmyard, breathing hard, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with a high, thin sound that would not entirely leave him for 2 days. Small cuts on his face and hands bled from grenade fragments and debris, minor wounds, nothing serious. Not one bullet had touched him. Around him lay 19 German soldiers in the configurations created by 4 grenade blasts, in groups where each one had landed, the way the math of explosion works on human bodies. Most were dead. A few were still moving. He could hear English voices behind him. His section was breaking from cover, advancing through the sudden silence, moving fast. They reached him and stopped. Sergeant William Fraser, who had fought in North Africa and Sicily and Normandy and the Scheldt and the Rhineland, a man who had seen more combat than most soldiers would see in 2 wars, looked slowly around the farmyard. His mouth opened. After a long moment, he found 4 words. "What the bloody hell," he said. Tommy bent down and picked up his own Lee Enfield from where he had left it before his fake surrender. He checked the chamber out of habit. Then he looked at Fraser with an expression that contained no discernible emotion. "They didn't search me properly, Sarge," he said. And that was all he said. 3 more German soldiers were found hiding in the farmhouse cellar. When they saw the farmyard, they put their hands up without being asked. Their hands shook so badly, one of them dropped his rifle. The Canadian medic checked Tommy and found nothing requiring serious attention beyond the cuts and a bruise forming on his left shoulder from where he had hit the ground rolling. The medic shook his head and said something quiet about luck that Tommy did not respond to. The 19 German casualties were confirmed and counted formally at 09:30 hours by the section's company commander, Captain James Morrison, who drove out from the regimental command post after Sergeant Fraser's radio report. Morrison walked the farmyard for 20 minutes without speaking, examining the grenade craters, the positions of the bodies, the scorch marks on the farmhouse wall, the blackened interior of the barn. Then he pulled Tommy aside and told him he was recommending him for the Victoria Cross. Tommy nodded. He didn't look proud. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Private Jim Mackenzie, 21 years old, from Hamilton, Ontario, wrote in his diary that evening at their temporary billet in a requisitioned farmhouse 3 kilometres to the west. His entry, dated March 7, 1945, reads, "We thought Tommy had lost his mind standing up like that. Laughing. Thought we were watching him die. Then something shifted in him, and it was like watching a different person entirely, something that wasn't afraid of anything. Never seen anything like it in 3 years. Don't think I will again. He saved us. All of us. No other word for it." Mackenzie would be killed 3 weeks later, on March 28th, during fighting near Emmerich in northern Germany. He was 21 years old. His diary was returned to his family in Hamilton and eventually donated to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, where it remains in the archive. Visitors occasionally ask to read it. Among the German dead was Lieutenant Wilhelm Hartmann of Munich. He was 23 years old. He had never met his daughter, who was born 2 months after his death in May 1945. His wife Greta had him reburied after the war in a permanent German war cemetery near Cleve and visited every year until her death in 1987. Their daughter grew up, became a schoolteacher, and spent her professional life in peace education. In 1985, interviewed for a West German documentary about the Rhine crossings, she said, "I do not blame the man who killed my father. I blame the war that put them both in that place. They were both just trying to survive." Hans Müller, one of 3 German soldiers who survived the farmhouse action, was 19 years old at the time. He lost his left arm to grenade shrapnel and suffered permanent hearing damage. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946 after treatment in a British military hospital. He became a carpenter, learned to work with one hand, married, had children and grandchildren. In a letter written in 1994 to a military historian researching Operation Plunder, he described Tommy as der lachende Teufel, the laughing devil, a name that spread through the surviving members of his unit and persisted in their accounts for decades. He wrote in that letter, "War makes men into things they never wanted to be. I am just grateful I survived to see my grandchildren." Tommy Higgins remained with the Regina Rifles through the final weeks of the war. In late April 1945, his unit liberated a small concentration camp near the German-Dutch border. He never spoke about what he saw there, even to the men who were standing beside him. Those men said he wept. This man, who had laughed while 19 guns were pointed at his heart, stood among the survivors of that camp and could not stop crying. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Tommy was in Groningen, Holland, when the news came through at 14:41 hours local time. The Dutch civilians came out of their houses and danced in the streets and threw flowers and wept and grabbed soldiers and kissed their faces. Tommy sat on the running board of a military truck and thought about the men from his regiment who were not there to see it. He received his military medal, the Victoria Cross recommendation, having been downgraded over questions about whether a simulated surrender violated the laws of war, at a regimental ceremony in June 1945 at a barracks outside Amersfoort in the Netherlands. The commanding officer pinned the ribbon to his chest. When the officer stepped back and saluted, Tommy said quietly, "I'd rather have the boys back who didn't make it, sir." The commanding officer, a veteran of the First World War as well as the Second, replied, "They'd rather you be here to remember them, Private." Tommy nodded and did not speak again. He sailed home to Canada in October 1945 on a troop ship out of Southampton, packed with men who had collectively survived things that no civilian vocabulary was adequate to describe. He married Ruth Elliott, his childhood sweetheart from Moose Jaw, in February 1946. She had written him a letter every single week for 3.5 years, even during the months when no reply came. They bought a farm outside Regina and raised 4 children. Tommy worked the land the same way his father had, up before sunrise, in from the fields at dark, finding in the rhythm of wheat and soil something that the years in Europe had damaged in him, and that farming slowly, partially, quietly repaired. He never told his children what he had done during the war. When they asked, he said, "I was a soldier," and found something else to talk about. This was not unusual. It was the common grammar of his generation, men who had done things they loved their families too much to describe to them. In 1982, a military historian named Dr. Gerald McInnes, researching Canadian operations during the Rhine campaign, tracked down Tommy's address through the Department of Veterans Affairs and telephoned him at his farm outside Regina on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Tommy was 61 years old and had been retired from farming for 2 years. He hesitated when McInnes explained the request, then agreed. The interview was conducted over 2 sessions, September 14th and 22nd, 1982, recorded on cassette tape. Listening to that recording now, you can hear Tommy's voice tighten and occasionally fracture when he speaks of the men who died, on both sides, in that farmyard on March 7th, 1945. He describes the mechanics of what he did with precision and without drama. He does not call himself a hero. When McInnes asked him if he was proud of what he had done, Tommy was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Pride isn't the word I'd use. I did what I had to do to survive and to bring my mates through. If there's anything worth being proud of, it's that we tried to build something decent afterward. That's the real legacy of everyone who served. Not the killing, the building." Thomas William Higgins died on April 3, 1998, at the age of 77, at the Regina General Hospital, from heart failure. His obituary in the Regina leader post mentioned his wartime service in a single line. 7 members of the Regina Rifles Regimental Association, all in their 70s, served as pallbearers at his funeral. His military medal was in a drawer in his bedroom. His family found it when they were clearing the house. The farmhouse near Rees, where the action took place, no longer stands. It was destroyed in subsequent fighting and never rebuilt. The land returned to agriculture after the war. Flat fields of wheat and barley now grow where the grenade craters were. The soil long since turned and turned again until the ground holds no visible memory of what happened there.